my goal all along, to fool you. Questions, please.
Yes. Yeah, so if I understand your question, basically, do we monitor that, and if it fails, if the project fails, would we go back up and fix it? The answer is yes. So we've done that. Yes, the Thousand Islands Land Trust, we have a couple projects that we've been back out to, 3 or 4 times, tweaking them to make them right. So the answer is yes.
John, I may have missed it, but I do, you can shut me off. But one slide I'm curious about is you showed a good deal of nest presence. I'm talking about basking along the one side of that island in the shallower water areas. Then you showed the nesting preference change, I guess, into deeper water areas where you had less production. I guess I'd be curious about 2 things. What do you think caused the bass to move from the shallower water edge to deeper water? And second, why in the deeper water, maybe they nest more vulnerable to gobies, I don't know, but you pointed out that the nest production down there is much less successful. So I'm kind of curious about what's behind the change in production success between the relocation and, well, I guess basically the relocation and why the relocation to shallower to deeper water.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, Tom. So there's still, it's an area of open research, so all we can do is speculate as to why the bass have moved from shallower to deeper sites. But Dave Phillip and Julie, who performed that research, also have data that macroalgae has really invaded the shallow nearshore areas, and there's like these balls of filamentous algae that come down that chute, and they speculated that possibly this was having a negative influence on nesting in that area. So I didn't talk about macroalgae today, but since the water clarity has increased dramatically in the river, we've seen a lot of increase in like, it's a macrophytic algae, so it's things like stonewort, muskgrass, chara, and they can form very thick layers in the near shore and crowd out other species. They're native plants with the exception of a couple algae. One is Nidalopsis. So we're seeing more changes in the near shore habitat than I presented. So that could be a factor. But we do see high goby densities in the shallow areas as well. So they have a big depth range. So it doesn't seem like they move deeper in response to the goby. That doesn't seem to make sense because the goby overlapped their range there.
Thank you.
Sure.
John, just, I missed it, you were pretty fast at the end there. The walleye story is very impressive, the reverse trend. Is that a goby issue too, or what do you think is that like?
Yeah, the restoration of walleye is a remarkable story. It happened prior to the goby introduction. I think gobies are, it took walleyes a year or 2 to figure out how to eat gobies, but now it's a pretty major part of their diet. And there were some groups that were trying to restore walleye runs in the ecosystem and some tributaries over in Oxbow. There's a famous walleye run that's been restored to its former glory. Now thousands of walleye spawn there. Many of the other tributaries had lost their walleye spawning, and now they're spawning there. There was a big resurgence in walleye in Bay of Quinte In the 70s, walleye and blue pike, which was its cousin, which was in this ecosystem, which is now extinct. Blue pike is a species that was here that we've lost from our ecosystem. But walleyes have made a big resurgence. I think some based on some of the stocking efforts. But you know those were typically Oneida Lake strain fish. And when we look at certain tributaries, they're Oneida Lake strain based. Sandy Creek, for example, where walleye have kind of moved from Port Bay along the shoreline. But a lot of our local populations, like Mud Bay, is a completely genetically unique population. The geneticists were just puzzled by the genetic difference between those walleye and some of the other strains. So it seems like there's been a lot of natural recovery on its own, and the population's back. It's just a wonderful thing.
So we're running very late and
Quick question.
really quick. And you're the last one.
Is the nutrition in largemouth bass trailing smallmouth bass, or do you have any numbers or a flavor for that?
Yeah, what was interesting, Jeff asked about comparisons between largemouth and smallmouth and population dynamics. They're not as well represented in the gillnet because of their nearshore tendencies. But we did have largemouth bass in our egg predation study. And one thing and I think we might have talked with you, we talked with other professional anglers, and we could not get largemouth bass to bite on the nest. You could not, like a smallmouth, you could dangle your car keys in front of them and they'd bite it. But a largemouth would hold to their nest and ignore your lure, so we had to remove them from the study because we could not remove them from the nest to look at egg predation. So that was a pretty big behavioral difference between those two species that might give it an advantage in terms of its exposure to egg predation. Plus, they're also, people once thought that gobies wouldn't invade the wetland habitats. They were wrong. Gobies are in highly vegetated, soft wetland habitats, but the degree of overlap between that and their preferred kind of rocky, unconsolidated bottom substrates, they're much more abundant, and so I think predation's lower due to that. Sure.
Thank you. You're going to be accountable to everybody in the room, so that's okay.
So May 5th is opening day for pike. June 16th is opening day for bass. Where are you going to be fishing?
I'm going to be in my lab, like, that's the problem, being a fish biologist. I had to, like, hang up my fishing rod. I still love to fish, but I go out later in the year. So that time of year, not good. Thank you.
You're all set. Thank you.